Let's play a game. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear this?
When the fun stops, stop.
When the fun stops, stop. As a football fan, you're likely quite familiar with that slogan. It's often written in yellow, and it comes right at the end of gambling advertisements like this one.
It's in the back of the net!
Play your best game with Build Your Odds from William Hill.
Now, if you watched the Chelsea-Everton game on Saturday night, there's a good chance that you saw that ad by William Hill. It only came on TV 20 minutes before kickoff. In fact, BT's entire pregame show was sponsored by Bet365. After all, football and betting go hand in hand. But much of that may be about to change. That's because this past week, the UK government started its review of domestic gambling laws. That means campaigners, journalists, MPs, not-for-profits, and betting companies will all be presenting evidence to the Department of Digital, Culture, Media, and Sport to see what needs to be changed and what needs to be kept. Today we ask, what is the UK's relationship with gambling and what reform is necessary?
Football and gambling are linked today in a more inextricable and deep way than they ever have been before.
Rob Davies covers gambling for The Guardian.
I'm 37, and I remember when I was growing up, you had things like the football pools, where you sort of bet on which matches would end up in a draw. You could also bet in bookmakers on kind of win, lose, or draw. But, that was more or less it. These days, gambling saturates pretty much every aspect of football. Everyone's familiar with the gambling sponsors on shirts, but you've got pitch-side hoardings as well that flash up all through the game. You've got TV ads. Every club has a betting partner. Those partnerships involve media appearances with players and coaches. A lot of the fan TV channels and the podcasts too are gambling sponsored now. Even when the teams are being read out in the ground, that team sheet will be sponsored by William Hill. I'm a Spurs fan. I go to Spurs a lot, and William Hill is their betting partner. And if you were to use the in-stadium Wi-Fi because you wanted to look at Ladbrokes or Bet365, you'd find you couldn't because of the exclusive deal with William Hill. So it's even affecting where you can browse the internet. So, you can't be a football fan and not hear about gambling pretty much 24/7.
We are speaking on Thursday, and this week the UK government has been reviewing its gambling laws. What specifically is it reviewing?
They're reviewing pretty much everything. So this is the beginning of a long process. It's a call for evidence, which means over the next 4 months, they ask to hear from everybody who wants to talk about gambling regulation and how it should change. And so you're going to have campaign groups, lobby groups, the industry, probably religious groups, maybe journalists like me sending in their thoughts about how gambling law should be changed and if it should be changed at all. And they're looking at everything from the types of products that people play, the type of gambling games, whether some of them are more dangerous than others, whether there should be limits on the amount you can bet on those games, limits on the amount you can lose, whether companies should be doing stricter affordability checks to make sure you're betting within your means. They're going to be looking at probably what's more relevant to football, marketing and sponsorship. So is there too much gambling advertising on TV? Should gambling companies be sponsoring football? We've seen in the past, for instance, that tobacco companies are no longer allowed to sponsor sport. So there's a precedent there. They're looking at whether or not the regulator that oversees gambling in the UK should have greater powers. It's a political sort of solution here. So they've left open pretty much any avenue that they might want to explore.
Now, obviously, the most important legislation that relates to gambling here in the UK is the Gambling Act of 2005. So what does that law say or prohibit, and how did it come about?
So the Gambling Act of 2005, well, it's big, right? This is a piece of legislation that runs to many hundreds of pages, possibly thousands, I'm not sure. But essentially what it changed is that prior to that in the UK, gambling existed, but you weren't allowed to solicit people to gamble, if you see what I mean. You weren't allowed to try and create demand where there was no demand. If there was obviously clamour for a betting shop in an area, you could open one, but you couldn't really advertise except for bingo, I think, and the lottery as well. So probably the biggest thing that the Gambling Act did was make it possible for companies to advertise. And so you had this huge explosion of gambling advertising because it coincided with two other things that were going on. First of all, an increase in the amount of football that was being broadcast, and football sort of predominantly watched by young and middle-aged men who also tend to be the most likely to gamble. And you also had the rise of the internet, which made it much easier for people to gamble and allowed you to advertise to them online as well. In some ways, the Gambling Act actually created a proper regulated environment where you had a regulator overseeing things, trying to make sure people weren't harmed by gambling and it didn't cause crime. But at the same time, it did help lead to this massive expansion in the number of ways that you can gamble and also in the visibility of gambling as well. So it's completely shaped the modern landscape of gambling. And Britain at the moment is probably the most what you would call mature market for gambling in terms of the diversity of product that's out there and the regulation as well. But many people feel that it's simply gone too far.
As you said, it kind of opened the floodgates. So how long have people been talking about changing this gambling law, and how long has this review been in the works that the government is having right now?
So it's just kind of gathered pace over, I would say, the last 6, 7, 8 years, really. I mean, there are some people who are always going to be ideologically opposed to gambling. Probably certain church or religious groups would be the most obvious ones among those. But there's just been this kind of slow build-up of horror stories that have slowly kind of filtered into the public consciousness and led to what I believe is kind of growing public concern about gambling.
I'm on my way to meet Alex, a 35-year-old teacher. He became so heavily addicted to online gambling through apps like these that he's resorted to perhaps the most drastic of measures to escape it. He's gone off the grid.
A lot of that came around the rise of these machines that were called fixed odds betting terminals. Basically like a roulette machine. You could go into a bookmaker and you could play it. And people were losing quite a lot of money on those. And there were links between those and addiction. And so there were a lot of stories that were written about that. A lot of people losing huge amounts of money, cases of people who were stealing to fund their habit, cases of people who committed suicide. And that became a big issue in the public eye for quite a long time because there was a government review that kind of narrowly looked at fixed odds betting terminals and one or two other things. So that kind of brought gambling more and more into the public consciousness. And those machines were eventually restricted quite heavily, so the maximum stake was reduced from £100 on those to £2. And essentially at that point, once that was done, attention has shifted to the rest of the gambling landscape. Because if you think about it, a fixed odds betting terminal was a £100 roulette spin that you could do in a bookmaker. But everybody now has a casino in their pocket, essentially. Everyone's got a smartphone. And so people have immediately started looking at online gambling and the dangers that are present there for people who, for whatever reason, are unable to control their gambling. And, there's been campaign groups, very effective campaign groups, journalists like me, just trying to highlight some of the extreme examples where people have suffered a lot of harm as a result of the kind of unfettered ability to gamble. And that's just led to increased pressure eventually. And the Conservative Party in their election manifesto and the Labour Party in their election manifesto both said that they would review gambling laws. So there's a kind of consensus across the parliamentary spectrum, across the political spectrum, that this is something that needs to be addressed, and that's where we find ourselves.
You mentioned earlier some of the initiatives that are being reviewed. What changes are under the most scrutiny as it relates specifically to football?
So with regard to football, there's 2 or 3 things that are probably most relevant. I mean, football shirt sponsorship tends to grab the headlines because that's really what's visible, right? I think 9 out of the 20 Premier League clubs have a gambling sponsor. It might be 10 this year. And in the Championship, it's even more. I think it's 17 out of 24. So they really make up the majority of the logos on the front of kits. So I think that would probably be the most high-profile one. Any more curbs on television advertising or even online advertising, that would be pretty big, because obviously that also affects the income that the broadcasters get and therefore the amount that they're able to spend on TV rights. And there are probably some other little bits and pieces depending on what the government decides to do, but they could look at the type of bets that people are placing, for instance. So in-play betting is something that was really pioneered by Bet365, and that's the kind of thing where you bet on who's going to get the next corner, or how many throw-ins there's going to be on the second half, or even just next goal scorer, and you can do that during the match. That's something a lot of researchers have flagged up as being potentially dangerous for certain types of people. So that's something that they might choose to look at.
So what possible impacts do you think some of these changes might have? I know you mentioned just a moment ago, shirt sponsorship and in-play betting.
Yeah, I mean, I think money is the kind of elephant in the room here. It's no coincidence that the majority of football teams in the two top tiers of English football are sponsored by gambling companies. There's a bidding process that goes on, right? That real estate on the front of a football shirt is valuable. And the gambling companies that are there because they agreed to pay more than other people who also wanted to appear on those football shirts. So clearly, if that was banned, that would have a financial impact on those football clubs that have those sponsorship deals. Now, the question is, what would the government then do to try and mitigate that? Because clearly there's a bit of a financial crisis going on, certainly in the second tier of English football and below. And if they lost that revenue stream, that would only intensify the crisis they're already facing, particularly with coronavirus on top of that and the impact that's had. So something would probably need to be done there, and there are a number of options that you could look at. I think that's the biggest potential impact here, certainly for football. I mean, gambling has just become a huge cash cow for football, and vice versa as well. Football's very lucrative for gambling. And when you have powerful financial interests like that at play, it's pretty difficult to get things changed. They've got powerful lobbying interests as well. So, look, I think we could see something like a full ban on sponsorship of football shirts, because that's a kind of high-profile measure that would probably go down quite well with the public. Whether it really solves the problem of gambling addiction is another question.
Yeah, just to give some context, there's around £100 million tied up in football shirt sponsorship by these big betting companies in the Premier League and, the EFL. So there is a lot of money at play with those shirt sponsorships. But do you think that's actually a pretty realistic outcome, considering actually a lot of these shirt sponsors are actually foreign betting companies? And, I don't even know that many UK betting companies might even mind getting rid of that, because a lot of them, like Ladbrokes and some others, don't even sponsor shirts. It's a lot of foreign companies.
Yeah, I mean, you've hit on a number of things that are quite important there. I mean, first of all, let's take the £100 million that's coming into the game as a result of those gambling sponsors. First of all, if you ban sponsorship, which I think is something that could happen, right? You don't lose £100 million. You lose whatever the gambling companies were prepared to pay that was more than companies that aren't gambling companies were prepared to pay, right? So you certainly have a financial impact, but it doesn't all disappear overnight. So the question is, how then do you replace that? I mean, there's a number of ways you could do that. For a start, there's no shortage of money in football, right? We all know that. So if it was shared more equitably between the very top clubs and the clubs further down the echelons of football, that might be one way to replace that money. You could introduce a levy on sports betting, so that, say, 1% of every sports bet goes towards the game. That's one way you could do it. So I think, from the financial point of view, that's one way to do it. You've also highlighted the fact that so many of the gambling sponsors are foreign betting companies. And that's a really interesting phenomenon. Essentially, what's going on there is that gambling marketing isn't permitted in a lot of the major economies where people want to gamble. So that's places like, particularly in Asia, so that's places like China, Thailand, Malaysia, where you have huge populations of people who love football, really want to gamble. Those companies can't advertise in their domestic market, so they advertise in the Premier League. A lot of them don't even really have a UK operation. They've got no interest in British punters. So actually, as you've identified, a lot of the big British gambling companies probably wouldn't mind all that much if gambling sponsorship were to disappear overnight, because they don't really do it. And the likes of Ladbrokes, William Hill, people like that, they don't really need football to be in the minds of British bettors. They're really well-known brands. So the people who would have most to lose would be those Asian companies and other foreign betting companies. It would also actually be some of the smaller players, companies like 32 Red, for instance, that has a big deal with Derby and sponsors lots of other gambling companies. Sponsors lots of other football clubs. And the reason they do that is because they're not as well known as your William Hills, your Ladbrokes, and they want to be more well known. So they'd have the most to lose, to be honest. And somebody like a William Hill, probably quite happy that some of their smaller rivals don't really have that route into people's living rooms anymore.
Are there any things that this gambling review is not really considering or taking into account that you think they should be looking at?
It's a pretty broad review, and I think they've kind of left it open to include things that they haven't explicitly said they're going to look at. I mean, one idea that I do think is interesting that I've already mentioned is this idea of a sports betting levy. I mean, at the moment, there's a levy on gambling companies that funds horse racing, because horse racing simply doesn't pay for itself anymore, right? Not enough people are interested in horse racing. If you did find that banning sports sponsorship created a financial crisis, particularly among some of the smaller clubs, I do think it would be worth looking at the idea of some kind of levy either on every bet or on the football-related profits of betting companies to kind of get some money into the game that way. That wasn't specifically mentioned in the terms of the review, even though I understand it was something that was considered. So I'm slightly in the dark now about whether that's an idea they completely abandoned or whether it's something they might return to. But I certainly think there's merit in discussing it.
In the following days, weeks, and months as this review is going on, how likely is it that you think we'll see major regulation or change to this gambling industry and as it relates to football specifically?
I mean, this is a long process, right? We're going to have a 16-week call for evidence, and then they have to gather all of that evidence, which is going to be, tens, hundreds of thousands of words of testimony, a lot of it conflicting. They've got to look at that. Then they'll do a consultation. Then after that, there'll potentially be a white paper, which is a sort of proposal for legal changes. I mean, the chances are we won't know what they're planning to do until summer next year, and it won't actually be done until sometime after that. So, there's a lot of scope for different voices to have their say in it. I do think we're going to end up with at least one or two changes that will have some sort of impact on football, whether that's limitations on sponsorship, tighter restrictions on advertising, in-play betting, whatever it might be. To be honest, I think football is robust enough to survive all of that. Football has survived pretty much everything else that's been thrown at it, including a global pandemic. And as I said before, there's no shortage of money in the game. It's just about whether that's being spread around equitably. I mean, if you look at the very largest clubs, none of the top 6 firms are sponsored by a gambling company, at least not on their shirt, because those companies are so large that they attract sponsorship deals from even bigger companies that can blow your average gambling firm out of the water when it comes to how much they spend on sponsorship. So, there's only a sort of a certain tier of football that has become reliant on gambling. And if you were to change the way that, say, TV rights were allocated, or if you were to look at some of the way that Premiership clubs have helped bail out the EFL this year, for instance, if you were to enshrine some of that in law and to say that actually more of the money from the upper tiers of football needs to go to the lower tiers of football, we could end up with a restructuring of the game, partly as a result of this gambling review that I think some people would welcome in terms of sharing the cash around a bit better.
Are you a fan of football today? Then why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full interviews, and extra content. Just go on Patreon and search Football Today. Now, back to the episode.
To learn more about gambling addiction and the impact of gambling ads, I spoke with Dr. Steve Sharman, who is a research fellow for the National Addiction Center and King's College London. Can you give a brief history of shirt sponsorships and betting ads in football?
Yeah, sure. So shirt sponsorship, I think the first team to have a shirt sponsor was Coventry City with the car company Talbot back in the 1980s. But in the Premier League era, so if you're thinking about from 1992 to sort of 93 onwards, there's been different industries that have provided greater or lesser proportions of shirt sponsors. So in the first 10 years of Premier League football, Shirt sponsorship was dominated by electronics companies, JVC, Brother, Sharp. And we also have alcohol brands such as things like McEwen's, Carlsberg and Holsten. The first gambling company wasn't on a Premier League shirt until the 2002-2003 season, I think, which is when Fulham had a partnership with Betfair. Over the years, we saw sponsorship by electronics companies and alcohol brands decreasing, and gambling sponsorship increased. So particularly in the 06-07 season, there were more teams in the Premier League sponsored by gambling companies than alcohol companies for the first time. And since then, prevalence of gambling shirt sponsors has pretty much increased across almost every season. And in 2019-20, there was 10 Premier League clubs that had a gambling company logo on their shirts, and I think it was 16 in the Championship. So as you can see, that's as the prevalence of sponsorship from alcohol companies has gone down, the prevalence of gambling companies has gone up.
But what about other ads or forms of sponsorship?
In terms of TV adverts, sort of similar to the shirts, really, the Gambling Act of 2005 was something that was a real watershed moment. That was fully implemented. The Act was 2005 and it was fully implemented by 2007. That really kind of moved the goalpost with regards to gambling and advertising. Whereas before, there was the only gambling adverts that were allowed were for the football pools, the National Lottery and for bingo premises. The 2005 Act opened the door for sports betting, online casinos and poker to be advertised. So it was from 2007 onwards when the Act was fully implemented that we really see an explosion in gambling adverts on television.
Earlier in the episode, we spoke with Rob Davies, who referenced cigarettes. You've studied addiction. How does gambling addiction compare to other things like cigarettes, alcohol, and drugs?
Yeah, it's always interesting to be asked to compare behavioural addictions and substance use addictions. There are a lot of similarities, but there's also some differences too. So in the most recent issue of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that's used to categorise different mental health disorders, gambling was moved from being classified as an impulse control disorder to an addictive disorder, and it was the first behavioural addiction to be classified this way. Now, this reclassification was actually made based on the wealth of evidence that showed that gambling demonstrated a similar underlying pathology to substance use disorders, kind of both from a psychological and a neurological perspective. So there's certain key diagnostic criteria, such as tolerance, preoccupation, withdrawal, continued use in the face of harm, etc., that are very similar between gambling and substance use. Then there's also elements that differentiate between the two. For example, in substance use, the reward you get is often physiological and sometimes psychological, whereas with gambling, you also have this potential for the financial reward. That's something that actually makes gambling as a behavioural addiction a bit more unique and a bit different from substance use. In terms of whether gambling is more addictive, it's really hard to say. It really depends on the individual, whether they're using a certain substance or engaging in a particular behaviour and what reward they get from it, because different things obviously will be more or less problematic for different people.
But it is on a similar level to those other things that we mentioned.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of key features of the behaviour that we see that are consistent across substance use disorders and behavioural disorders such as gambling disorder.
In your research, you've spoken with lots of gambling addicts. What have you learned speaking with them and hearing their experiences?
So I've done many bits of different research focused on gamblers at different points on the harm spectrum. I've worked with those that hardly ever gamble to some of those with real serious problems. And I guess one of the main things that I've really learned is that it's really hard to talk about gamblers as one homogenous group. There's not really any two gamblers that are the same. So every individual who gambles have their own reasons for starting to gamble, have their own reasons for carrying on, and they take different rewards out of it. For some people it is the excitement, it's the thrill. Sometimes it's to escape from the real world. Sometimes it's just because they have to try and go back to win what was previously lost. But yeah, I think one of the major things that I've really learned is that gamblers have quite a lot of insight into their own behaviour when they're not gambling, and it's really interesting how that insight kind of gets ignored once they get into what might be termed like a gambling zone. But yeah, there's enormous heterogeneity in those that gamble.
Now, something I read that I thought was quite interesting was that less than 3% of problem gamblers in England, according to the NHS Health Survey, received care, and this was in the last year. Why are gambling addicts receiving so little care? I imagine those numbers would probably be a little bit higher if it was for alcoholics or drug abusers.
I think there's a couple of reasons here, a couple of points to discuss. So gambling is sometimes referred to as the hidden addiction, and it is called that for a good reason. Like, it's very easy to hide compared to a substance use disorder. So, for example, in substance use, there's often physiological symptoms, but there isn't really that in the case of gambling. So an individual with a gambling problem, it's much easier for them to hide anything that's going on than it would be with a substance use problem. So there isn't that kind of other person helping you identify the problem that you might get in a substance use disorder. I think this is also partly where this responsible gambling mantra that is constantly promoted is actually extremely unhelpful. So we hear this phrase a lot, and it does nothing but put all the responsibility on the individual. It pretty much absolves the companies themselves of any responsibility. And the implication is those that have issues with gambling or problems with gambling are therefore somehow irresponsible. Now, that only serves to really reinforce kind of the shame and the stigma that's often associated with gambling or disordered gambling. And that's likely to prevent help seeking until crisis point is reached. So the way in which gambling is portrayed in the UK and where the blame for harm is subtly pointed, I think, are significant factors in low levels of help seeking.
So how important are ads and, shirt sponsorships to making people gambling or betting addicts?
That's quite a difficult question to answer, as obviously there's not one thing that necessarily makes a disordered gambler. However, increased exposure to adverts does do two things. First of all, it really normalizes gambling behavior. So if gambling is everywhere and it's just accepted that it's a thing that people do, then it becomes harder for an individual to identify any potential problems in their own behavior or actually understand that the way they're gambling is harmful. As the repeated exposure through kind of adverts and other marketing, it shifts the perspective of a baseline norm. Secondly, advertising potentially creates a relationship. So, for example, somebody might not have a betting account, but they might be watching a football match or something, and they'll see a bonus offer or a sign-up offer, and that prompts them to create an online account. Now, that in itself doesn't create a disordered gambler, but what it does create is the opportunity, once the individuals have created that account, for the company to directly market to that individual and to push them to potentially more harmful products, send them extra offers, etc. And from there, it's there that we can potentially see problems develop.
So what impact would limiting or eliminating in-stadium sponsorship or marketing or sponsorship on shirts?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think the only way for any kind of reduction, whether it be that in-stadium or shirt sponsorship, the only way for any kind of reduction in advertising to be effective is for it to take a completely holistic, across-the-board approach. So there's not really, I don't see that there's much point in restricting one source and attempting to quantify that impact on addiction or on general gambling behavior, whilst not considering the investment in other forms of advertising. So a good example of this, I think, is we know that the Betting and Gaming Council, the BGC, implemented their own voluntary whistle-to-whistle ban on TV adverts during live matches. And to much fanfare, they've trumpeted that this has resulted in a significant reduction in gambling adverts during live TV football matches. Now, whilst this is true, it may be true, they have reduced the number of adverts that we've seen. It completely ignores the fact that more often than not, there's at least one team will have a gambling company shirt sponsor. There are many, many pitch-side hoardings with gambling logos on. And during this period of playing in empty stadiums, there's even been big gambling company logos on banners across seats. So through the adverts, the TV adverts themselves might be gone. The matches themselves still have massive exposure to gambling, rendering the ad ban almost kind of obsolete. So for a reduction in marketing, advertising or sponsorship to be effective, it would need to consider all the channels that marketing is done by and reduce across all those channels simultaneously.
Yeah, so we would have to be quite holistic in the limitation of these sponsorships or marketing. We couldn't just look at it as, okay, we've stopped it on shirt sponsorships and that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other interesting thing about the whistle-to-whistle TV ban is that we kind of know that the proportion of marketing spend from gambling companies that goes on TV advertising is actually relatively small. Like they do invest a lot of money in other marketing channels. So yeah, there's not really much worth in focusing only on one marketing channel. You need to take that holistic approach for any kind of reduction or to have an impact on gambling behavior.
Obviously, the UK government aren't the only people worried about this. People in, Spain and Italy in recent years have dealt with this issue. What have you learned from other countries and their approach to gambling advertising?
Yeah, so this has been really interesting in a couple of the other major leagues. So in Italy, there was a decree passed in 2018 that banned a lot of gambling advertising, and specifically pertinent for football, it banned the sponsorship of football teams by gambling companies. Initially, they were all supposed to be terminated by, I think it was the 1st of January 2019, although they then extended that to July of the same year. I think that was to allow existing deals to expire kind of over the closed season. And then in Spain, had something similar. I mean, this is a bit more recent in that it was in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the government had fears of an upsurge in gambling with people kind of stuck at home with not much to do. So the Spanish government introduced a decree that was like a social shield that severely restricted the ability of gambling companies to advertise during this period. Some of the restrictions were eased, but then when La Liga resumed on the 12th of June, the ban was still in place on all in-stadium gambling marketing. So that meant there was no grace period to honour existing deals. There was just this blanket ban on in-stadium advertising for gambling companies implemented straight away. And it actually meant that I think it was 8 clubs were forced to resume the season with blanked out shirt sponsors. So it seems like other countries have been taking more decisive steps towards kind of trying to put a bit of a break on that relationship between gambling and football.
From your perspective, what do you think that the Gambling Review should be looking at closely?
Yeah, so there's a couple of areas that the review will address, and I hope they are addressed in a lot of detail. This has to be evidence-led. We have to make sure that the review is conducted in a thoroughly independent and evidence-led way. I'd really like to have there to be a close look at the way, as we've discussed, the way gambling is advertised and promoted. We have to do something about the constant exposure to gambling marketing across TV, social media, radio, direct mail, even things like the certain apps that you can look at to check scores that are now owned by gambling companies. So there's the live odds and the being implored to bet now, even if all you're trying to do is check a football score. So the constant barrage of gambling marketing is something that we definitely need to get a hold of and needs to be regulated and legislated in a far more kind of robust way. The other thing that I think we need to look at is how the punishments are administered to companies that are found to be breaking the rules, that are found to be exploiting vulnerable gamblers, that are found to be not exercising the kind of corporate social responsibility that they should be. Currently, when companies are found to have broken the rules or broken the terms of their licensing condition, they're often getting fines. Now, these fines might look good, they might generate good headlines, but £1 million, £4 or £5 million fine to a gambling company generally isn't very much. So financial fines aren't really much of a deterrent for a change in behaviour. So we need to look at how we actually ensure that the gambling companies themselves adhere to the rules that as they currently are.
So what are your feelings on this Gambling Review? Are you optimistic or concerned? What do you think the future holds with this Gambling Review?
Sort of optimistic and concerned. I think this review has been a long time coming. I think there does appear to be appetite for change, both within the general public and within the government. My concerns would be that we've known this has been coming for a long time. The gambling industry themselves have known that this review has been coming for a long time, so have been playing a long game and have been manoeuvring their chess pieces into position. So my only concern would be that the industry is a little bit closer to the review than many people kind of would be comfortable with. But we will have to wait and see how it plays out.
Rob Davies is a business reporter for The Guardian, where he covers gambling, alcohol, tobacco, and secondary ticketing. Dr. Steve Sharman is a research fellow for the National Addiction Center and King's College London. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions, and you can find more information about those songs in the episode show notes. This episode was produced by myself and John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and thanks for listening to Football Today. And before you go, if you're a fan of the show and would like to support us, why not sign up to our Patreon page where you'll get access to full interviews, bonus episodes, and extra content. And if you can't spare the cash, please tell a friend instead. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.